I'm Marissa Cole, 30 years old, and if you asked anyone in my family to describe me, they'd probably say, I'm dependable. That night at the family dinner, I sat across from my mother as she gave me a smile that I had learned to recognize all too well. It wasn't the smile of affection, but the polished one she wore before announcing a decision that had already been made. My father stayed quiet, his fork moving steadily, while my younger sister Natalie scrolled through her phone without even looking at me. I had driven 2 hours to be there carrying the familiar weight of obligation, not excitement. And as the chatter circled the table, I felt the heaviness in my chest that told me something was about to change. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you've ever felt taken for granted by the very people you call family. I grew up in a house where appearances mattered more than truth. My mother believed in keeping things smooth on the surface even when chaos boiled underneath. My father worked long hours, rarely raising his voice, but never really stepping in to shield me when I needed it. From the time I was young, it was clear that Natalie was the star of the household. She had charm, spontaneity, and a talent for turning her mistakes into someone else's problem. Whenever she stumbled, my parents excused it, folding quickly to her tears and excuses, while I was expected to quietly absorb the fallout. By contrast, I was the one who kept my head down. I studied hard, cleaned up after myself, and did what was asked without complaint. While Natalie leapt from one half-baked plan to the next, I was expected to be steady, reliable, and above all available. If Natalie broke something, I fixed it. If she made a mess, I cleaned it up. That pattern continued into adulthood. I worked my way through college, held steady jobs, and learned how to stretch every paycheck to cover rent and groceries. Meanwhile, Natalie bounced from boyfriend to boyfriend, job to job, always in crisis, always needing a soft place to land. And for my parents, that soft place was always me. There were moments I tried to push back, telling them I needed space, or reminding them that I had my own life to manage. But guilt has a way of silencing those words. My mother had mastered the art of reminding me how lucky I was to be the stable one, how Natalie's struggles meant I needed to be patient, kind, and willing to step up. Each time I folded, convincing myself it was easier to give in than to argue. Over time, my boundaries blurred until even I wasn't sure where they began. Still, part of me hoped things would settle down as we grew older, that maybe Natalie would find her footing, and I'd be allowed to simply live my life. But that evening at the dinner table reminded me just how wrong I was, because the moment my mother leaned forward, folding her hands like she was about to share good news, I knew exactly what was coming, and when she spoke, the words confirmed everything I had feared. She didn't ask me. She didn't even pause to see my reaction. She simply announced it as though my opinion was irrelevant, as though my life was hers to rearrange. And in that instant, I understood that nothing had changed at all. The same roles I'd been forced to play since childhood were about to be written all over again. The fork in my hand had barely touched my plate when my mother leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table with that gentle expression she always wore before delivering news I wouldn't like. "Natalie will be moving in with you for a while," she said, her tone light, as if she were talking about the weather. My father didn't even pause in his meal, chewing steadily, as though the words meant nothing out of the ordinary. Natalie glanced up only briefly, then back down at her phone, her thumb moving quickly across the screen. I sat frozen in place, my fork suspended above the mashed potatoes, wondering if I had really heard her correctly. She continued, speaking carefully like it was already settled. "Just until she gets back on her feet. You've got that nice apartment all to yourself, Marissa. It just makes sense." That phrase again, the one my mother used to close the door on any disagreement. My father cleared his throat and added, "It's not like you can't manage it. You've got that steady job, flexible hours. Natalie just needs a reset, and you're the one who can give it to her." He leaned back in his chair, folding his napkin neatly, as if that ended the matter. I glanced at Natalie, waiting for her to speak, but she only smirked as though she had already won something. "I can help out," she said lightly, finally setting her phone aside. "Cooking, cleaning, whatever. I'm not going to freeload." I nearly laughed, remembering the last time she promised the same thing. My kitchen had ended up with scorched pans, and my bathroom filled with laundry she never touched. But no one else seemed to question her words. My mother beamed at her, nodding eagerly, while my father gave a short, approving grunt. The conversation moved forward as though my silence was consent. My mother's voice picked up with relief, saying how wonderful it would be for Natalie to have some stability, how grateful she was that I always came through. My father agreed, talking about how families needed to support each other. I sat there in the middle of it, listening to them speak about my life as though I wasn't present at the table at all. The expectation was clear. Natalie's move had already been decided. My role was to simply accept it. I thought back to the many times before when the same pattern had unfolded. The Thanksgiving Natalie came for the weekend and stayed 3 months, leaving wine-stained glasses across my living room. The time she drained her credit cards and I was pressured to co-sign a lease she couldn't keep. The whispered phone calls from my mother reminding me of Natalie's fragile state and how much easier my life had always been. Each time I resisted guilt was used like a tool, carving away at my boundaries until I gave in. That night at the table was no different. My mother placed her hand on mine, squeezing it as though to sweeten the sting of her words. "You have such a kind heart, sweetheart. Your sister is lucky to have you." I forced a small nod, my expression carefully neutral. Across the table, Natalie brightened at the thought of moving in, already listing what she might bring with her: a few boxes, clothes, maybe her desk. "I could come Saturday," she said, looking at my parents for confirmation instead of me. "That way we can pack up tomorrow." My mother clapped her hands together with satisfaction. "Perfect. We'll all help. It will be quick." The decision rolled forward with a momentum I couldn't stop. They didn't ask if I wanted this. They didn't ask how it would affect my life. They assumed, as they always had, that I would adjust, absorb, and manage it. My father talked about how it would only be temporary, a few months at most. My mother promised it would help everyone. Natalie leaned back, looking pleased, certain of her place in the plan. I stayed quiet, letting the moment pass with a small, practiced smile. They mistook it for agreement, and relief spread across their faces. For them, the problem had been solved. For me, the problem had only just been laid bare, sharper than it had ever been before. They had spoken over me, around me, and for me. In their eyes, I wasn't a daughter with a life of her own, but a convenient answer whenever Natalie's life unraveled. Dinner carried on as though nothing had happened. My father asked about work. My mother fussed over the food. Natalie laughed at something on her phone. Yet the decision hung in the air, sealing itself into place with each passing minute. I sat there nodding when appropriate, chewing, slowly, speaking little. They believed I had agreed, that I had once again slipped into the role they had carved out for me since childhood. But beneath the surface, a quiet shift was stirring. I had played this role before, giving in to what they wanted, smoothing the edges, carrying the weight that wasn't mine. Only this time I knew something they didn't. They thought they were moving Natalie into my life. They had no idea that the life they imagined was already gone. The ride home from that dinner was quiet, but the silence inside my car wasn't the peaceful kind. The headlights stretched out along the highway, and I gripped the steering wheel tighter than usual. My family believed they had decided something simple, that Natalie would move in, and I would accept it. To them, it was natural, the same way it had always been. To me, it felt like history looping back around in the most familiar way. I thought about the years when I first lived on my own. I had chosen a tiny studio apartment downtown, no bigger than a shoebox, but it was mine. I worked long hours at a retail job while finishing school, stretching paychecks to cover bills. Even then, Natalie drifted in and out. She would call late at night saying she had nowhere to go, and within an hour, she'd be asleep on my couch with her shoes still on. Those nights became weeks, and weeks became months. Every time I tried to draw a line, my mother's voice echoed through the phone. She would remind me how fragile Natalie was, how much harder life seemed for her. "You've always been more stable," she would say softly, almost like a compliment. But it wasn't praise. It was a reminder that stability meant sacrifice. It meant that I was the one expected to bend. The pattern carved itself into my life. I remember the year Natalie maxed out 3 credit cards and couldn't qualify for a new lease. My mother didn't ask me directly. She presented it like a decision that had already been made. "Just co-sign," she said. "You'll be helping your sister get back on track." I told her I couldn't afford the risk, but she pressed until I folded. I carried the weight of that signature for months, terrified I'd be left with a debt that wasn't mine. There was the Thanksgiving when Natalie arrived with a small duffel bag, promising she'd only stay for a few days. By Christmas, she was still there, her belongings scattered through every room, her laughter filling the space while I quietly cleaned up behind her. Friends stopped visiting because there was never room, and my own home felt borrowed. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't push her out. I endured telling myself it was temporary. I had learned to keep my complaints quiet. If I tried to protest, the guilt would settle quickly. My mother's words were sharp but polished. "You don't know what it's like to feel like a failure," she whispered once when I told her I couldn't handle Natalie staying longer. "She's struggling, and you've always had it easier." I swallowed those words like medicine I didn't want to take. Easier. That was how they saw it. In truth, it never felt easier. I bottled frustration while Natalie broke things without consequence. I skipped dinners out with friends so I could cover groceries when she spent her money elsewhere. I stayed quiet when she invited people over and left me awake at midnight with the sound of voices echoing down the hallway. My silence was survival, a way to avoid arguments that always ended with me carrying more than I could bear. The weight followed me everywhere. At work, I smiled through long meetings, even when exhaustion from sleepless nights pressed behind my eyes. I kept my apartment tidy, though I knew it would never last with Natalie's mess, spreading from corner to corner. I carried the unspoken role of fixer, the steady one who would never let the family fall apart. And because I didn't push back hard enough, everyone believed I was fine. But I wasn't. I kept my distance from family gatherings when I could, inventing excuses about work or traffic. I learned to hold my tongue at the dinner table, nodding instead of speaking, so I wouldn't be drawn into new obligations. Yet each time I thought I had stepped away, something else pulled me back. It was as if the role had been assigned at birth, and no matter how much I tried to walk away, it was written into every conversation. That night after dinner, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling with my phone buzzing on the nightstand. Messages from my mother came one after another, reminders of moving plans and questions about what Natalie should pack. I typed polite replies, my hand steady, even as my heart pounded. It was easier to nod, to say sure to keep the peace. But under the surface, something sharper stirred. For years I had told myself it wasn't worth fighting that giving in kept the family together. But as I scrolled through my mother's messages, I felt the first quiet tug of something I hadn't allowed myself before. I thought about how many times I had set my needs aside, how many times my home had stopped being mine. I thought about how easily they had spoken over me that evening, making decisions for my life without hesitation. The silence in my apartment was different now. It wasn't just the absence of voices or footsteps. It was the realization that my silence had been their permission. They believed I would always stay quiet, that I would always agree in the end. That night, as I closed my eyes, I knew something had shifted inside me. The familiar pattern had repeated once again, but this time I wasn't sure I could slip back into it so easily. I didn't know what would come next, only that the old way of living had begun to feel impossible. And with Saturday approaching, when they planned to move Natalie into my life once more, the weight of it all pressed down heavier than ever before. I spent the next few days moving carefully, like someone carrying a secret too delicate to expose. To my family, nothing had changed. I still replied to my mother's texts, still nodded when my father spoke of Natalie's move, and even answered Natalie's message about whether there was room for her yoga mat. Plenty I wrote back, keeping my tone light. They believed I was preparing to welcome her. What they didn't know was that my home was already gone. 2 weeks earlier, I had signed the lease on a new place across the river. It was a one-bedroom condo with hardwood floors that glowed in the afternoon sun, tall windows that opened to a view of the city skyline, and a quiet that stretched into every corner. The first time I walked through it barefoot, the cool floor beneath my skin, I realized I had never truly owned my space before. There was no second toothbrush on the counter, no pile of someone else's laundry spilling across the hall. For once, everything around me was mine. The move had been deliberate and slow. I carried boxes 1 carload at a time after work, stacking them carefully until the old apartment was empty. I sold the place quietly through a private listing, paying extra to remove my name from databases so no one could track me. Not even my closest friends knew my new address. It wasn't secrecy born of malice, but of necessity. After years of being everyone's fallback plan, I wanted something unreachable, something untouched. Each night I returned to the new condo, I felt the weight lifting. I brewed coffee in silence, the only sound the soft drip of water in the machine. I rearranged the bookshelf twice just because I could. I left dishes in the sink without guilt, knowing no one would judge me or add their own to the pile. Small things, ordinary things, but they felt like a freedom I had never allowed myself before. The contrast between the two worlds sharpened each day. At my parents' table, I was the steady daughter, the one who quietly accepted her role. At my condo, I was simply Marissa, not defined by what Natalie lacked or what my mother demanded. That separation gave me clarity I hadn't expected. For the first time in years, I didn't feel guilty for wanting peace. The night before they were supposed to bring Natalie over, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the city lights shimmer across the water. My phone buzzed with a final round of messages, my mother confirming the time, my father reminding me to have space ready, Natalie saying she didn't have much, just a few boxes. I replied with a simple, "Sounds good, I'll be there," and I would be just not in the way they imagined. As the clock ticked past midnight, I realized I wasn't nervous. I wasn't dreading their arrival or bracing for the weight of Natalie's presence in my life again. Instead, I felt steady, almost calm, like I had finally stepped out of a storm I had been standing in for too long. It wasn't just about protecting my apartment. It was about protecting the version of myself I had always hidden beneath obligation. I walked through the condo one last time before bed, running my hand along the smooth counter, checking the locked door, glancing at the neat stack of boxes I hadn't finished unpacking. Everything around me reminded me that I had built this space with intention. It wasn't a borrowed room or a waiting area for someone else's problems. It was mine in every sense of the word. When I turned off the lights and lay down, I thought about the years behind me, the silence I carried, the weight. I absorbed the boundaries I never drew. Tomorrow, those patterns would meet a wall they didn't expect. For the first time, I wasn't bracing to fold under pressure. I was ready to stand. Saturday morning arrived without the need for an alarm. I woke early sunlight streaming through the wide windows of my new condo, the city still quiet beyond the glass. My body felt wired with anticipation, not fear, but something steadier. I brewed a pot of coffee and sat on the couch, legs tucked beneath me, watching the steam curl upward as the clock ticked closer to noon. Across town, I imagined my parents loading boxes into my father's SUV, Natalie bustling around as though she were preparing for a fresh start. None of them knew what they were truly walking into. By late morning, my phone began to buzz. First came a call from an unfamiliar number, then another. I let them ring. A voicemail appeared, but I didn't press play. When the fourth call lit up the screen, I finally answered. My mother's voice came through sharp and frantic. "Marissa, what is going on? We're here at your apartment. The landlord says you moved weeks ago. There are new tenants inside." Behind her words, I heard my father shouting, Natalie crying out in disbelief. I let the silence stretch before I spoke, keeping my voice calm. "Oh, really? That's strange. I thought I mentioned it." "No, you didn't," my mother snapped. "You never said a word about moving. We're standing here with her things in the car. What are we supposed to do now?" My father's voice cut in hard and angry. "This is ridiculous, Marissa. You promised. Natalie has nowhere else to go. Her bags are packed. Everything is ready." I swirled the last sip of coffee in my mug, keeping my tone steady. "But I don't live there anymore," I said simply. For a moment, the line went quiet. Then Natalie shouted in the background, her words tumbling out sharp and fast. "You're doing this to punish me. You let us go through all of this just to humiliate me." I closed my eyes, listening to the weight of their frustration press against me through the phone. "This isn't a joke," my father said, finally, his voice dropping low. "You've embarrassed us. You've left your sister stranded. What kind of person does that to their own family?" I held the phone to my ear, breathing slowly before answering. "I'm sorry," I said softly, "but I'm not responsible for where Natalie sleeps. That was never my agreement." My mother's voice cracked as she tried again. "You said yes at dinner, Marissa. You agreed." "No," I replied, keeping my tone even. "I said I would be there, and I was, just not where you expected me to be." There was a long pause on the line, heavy and stunned. I pictured them standing outside the building, the car packed with Natalie's belongings, neighbors watching as the truth settled in. Finally, my father muttered, almost to himself, "I don't understand. Why would you do this?" I leaned back against the couch, the empty mug resting in my hands. "Because for once," I said, my voice quiet, but certain I wanted to choose myself. Then I ended the call. The silence afterward was thick and startling. I set the phone face down on the table and waited for the wave of guilt I had always feared would come. Instead, a strange calm settled over me, like the first breath of air after being underwater too long. My phone buzzed again and again across the room, but I didn't move to pick it up. For the next hour, I let myself move slowly through the condo. I watered the plants by the window, adjusted a drawer I hadn't bothered to organize, and placed a record on the turntable, the soft notes filling the space. My phone lit up with messages from my mother, pleading from my father, demanding from Natalie, accusing. I read none of them. Their voices had always been loud in my life, but for the first time, I allowed the noise to stay outside. Around 2 p.m, the calls stopped. The quiet didn't last long. A sharp knock rattled against the door, pulling me from the kitchen. I froze, then moved carefully to the peephole. Through the glass, I saw my father's SUV at the curb, the trunk still crammed with boxes and blankets. My parents stood close to the door, Natalie just behind them, her arms crossed tight. I didn't open the door right away. They spoke in hushed tones, gesturing toward the building, their frustration plain even through the narrow view. The knock came again, louder this time. I drew a steady breath and opened the door slowly, just enough to face them. My mother's expression was brittle as she spoke first. "We tried calling you." "Why didn't you answer?" "I know," I replied quietly. "That was intentional." She glanced past me into the condo, her eyes darting across the unfamiliar hallway. "We didn't even know you lived here." "That's kind of the point," I said. My father stepped forward, his voice hard. "This has gone far enough. We brought Natalie's things. She has nowhere else to go." I met his eyes, my voice steady. "Then maybe you should have asked me before assuming I was still the emergency plan." Natalie pushed past them, her face tight with anger. "You lied," she snapped. "You said I could move in." I shook my head. "I let you talk. I never agreed." My mother's voice rose, breaking under pressure. "We packed her life into a car, drove all the way here. You let us believe. And how many times I interrupted. Quietly have I packed away my needs for this family." For a moment, no one spoke. The air between us thickened heavy with years of unspoken truths. Then Natalie scoffed, her voice trembling with rage. "Fine. If you won't let me in, we'll make you." She stepped closer as though she meant it, her hand brushing against the doorframe, her eyes daring me to resist. I stood still, then slowly reached for my phone. My thumb hovered over the screen as I looked at each of them in turn. Their faces shifted. My father's jaw clenched, my mother's eyes wide with disbelief. Natalie's expression burning with entitlement. Without another word, I pressed the button. Natalie's words lingered in the air, sharp and defiant. "If you won't let me in, we'll make you." She stepped forward like she meant it, her hand brushing against the door as if it already belonged to her. My mother's face tightened, torn between anger and disbelief. My father stood stiff, his jaw set, eyes locked on me. For years they had treated my boundaries like suggestions, expecting me to fold in the end. But this time was different. I held my phone in my hand and pressed the screen, my thumb steady. The line clicked, and a calm voice answered. 911, what's your emergency?" I matched the tone without hesitation. "Yes, I'd like to report trespassing. My family is attempting to enter my home without permission. They've been told to leave and I'm feeling unsafe." The change in their faces was immediate. My father's expression hardened into fury, while Natalie's mouth fell open in shock. My mother's voice dropped to a whisper full of disbelief. "You're calling the police on us." I didn't flinch. "I am," I replied, "because no one else has ever protected my boundaries before, so now I will." For 10 minutes, we stood in silence. Them on the stoop, me inside the door cracked just wide enough to hold my ground. Then the faint sound of sirens drifted closer, steady and certain. 2 squad cars pulled up quietly without flashing lights, but the weight of their arrival pressed against all of us. It was no longer a family disagreement hidden behind closed doors. It was something undeniable. A tall female officer stepped out first, her voice even. "Good afternoon. Someone placed a call about trespassing." I stepped forward, my words clear. "That was me. This is my residence." They arrived uninvited and refused to leave when asked. She glanced past me into the condo, then back at my parents. "Can you confirm this?" My mother opened her mouth, but the officer raised a hand. "Ma'am, I'm not here to mediate family disputes. If your daughter has asked you to leave, you are required to do so." Natalie's voice cracked as she tried to argue. "I'm her sister. She said I could move in. She promised." I met her eyes and spoke evenly. "I let you talk at dinner. I never agreed. That was a performance you chose to believe." My father stepped closer, his voice heavy with accusation. "After all we've done for you, this is how you repay us." I held his gaze. "You helped me? Or did I carry your other daughter every time she collapsed and burned? Which one is it?" His words faltered silence, filling the space where his anger had lived. The officer moved forward, her tone firm. "I need you all to leave the premises now. If you refuse, we'll have to escalate this legally." My mother's hands trembled at her sides, her eyes wet with frustration. Natalie's fists clenched, her words unsteady. "You're not even human anymore, Marissa." I didn't smile out of cruelty, but out of release. "I finally am." They didn't speak again, not as they lifted Natalie's bags from the stoop, not as they carried the boxes back to the car, not as the officers stood by watching quietly to ensure the departure. When the SUV door shut and the vehicle rolled down the street, the silence that followed was deeper than any I had ever known. Inside, I leaned against the door as the officers lingered. One of them, her badge reading Torres, paused before leaving. "If they come back or continue harassing you, don't hesitate to call again," she said gently. I nodded, the weight of her words pressing against the stillness. "Thank you." She gave a small smile. "You did the right thing." When the door closed and the last footsteps faded down the hallway, I was alone again. The hum of the refrigerator filled the quiet, steady, and low. I pressed my palms flat to the wood of the door, letting the gravity of what had just happened sink into me. It wasn't fear I felt, nor sadness, but something heavier and steadier, like my life had shifted onto solid ground for the first time. I made a cup of tea and sat on the couch with my knees drawn up, the cup warm between my hands. My phone lit up across the room, a flood of messages waiting, but I didn't move toward it. I let them sit unanswered, the way my own needs had sat too long in silence. Tomorrow the aftermath would come. Tonight, there was only stillness. After the officers left the condo, fell into a quiet that felt complete. No shouts from the hallway, no pounding at the door, just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the sound of my own breathing slowing down. I leaned against the couch, the steam from my tea curling upward, while my phone lit up across the room with one notification after another. I didn't reach for it. For once, their voices could stay outside. When I finally scrolled through later that evening, the messages came in waves. My mother's words swung between pleading and fury, long texts filled with disbelief. My father wrote about humiliation, accusing me of disgracing the family. Natalie's messages were harsher still, accusing me of abandoning her, calling me selfish, cruel, and cold. The words scrolled across the screen, sharp and endless, but I read them with a steadiness I hadn't felt before. Then I blocked every number, not out of spite, but because the cycle had to end somewhere. The next day, the silence held. No calls, no knocks, no unexpected arrivals. I poured myself coffee and sat in the stillness sunlight spreading across the floorboards. For years, I had believed silence meant distance or punishment. Now it felt like room to breathe. I wasn't empty, and I wasn't alone. My life was filled with people who cared without conditions. Co-workers who checked in, neighbors who waved good morning, friends who invited me without keeping score. Cutting ties hadn't left me abandoned. It had cleared the space for something healthier to grow. That weekend, I called my best friend, someone I hadn't opened up to in months. We talked through everything, the story spilling out piece by piece from the dinner table to the police at my door. She listened without judgment, only breaking the silence once I was finished. "You really did it," she said softly. I let out a long breath I didn't realize I had been holding. "Yeah, and I don't feel guilty." "You're not supposed to," she replied, her voice steady. "Sure." The conversation didn't need more than that. We let the silence stretch, a comfortable one this time, filled with the safety of being understood. Later that evening, she stopped by with dinner. Nothing fancy, just takeout containers we opened across the coffee table. We ate and talked about small things, laughing at stories from work, the weight of the past few days, softening into something manageable. For the first time in a long while, I felt like myself in someone else's company, not the dependable daughter, not the fallback plan, just Marissa. As the week passed, the absence of my family's demands began to feel less like a gap and more like a gift. I came home each night to find the condo just as I had left it. No shoes at the door that weren't mine, no piles of laundry spreading beyond control, no chaos waiting for me. The space reflected my choices, and each small detail reminded me of the line I had drawn. Justice hadn't come through revenge or anger. It had come through boundaries finally respected, even if enforced by necessity. 1 week later, my birthday arrived. For the first time, there were no cards in the mail from my parents, no calls, no half-hearted messages from Natalie. The silence could have stung, but it didn't. I took the day off work, walking along the river with the spring air drifting cool and steady against my face. I stopped at a small cafe, ordered lunch for myself, and read a book without rushing. It felt ordinary, but in that ordinariness was freedom. When I returned home, I carried flowers I had bought for myself, tulips, lavender, and daisies bundled together. I placed them in a vase by the window, the stems leaning toward the light, and for a moment I stood quietly and just let the scene settle. It was simple, but it was mine. That night, I invited a few friends over. We cooked together in the kitchen, laughter filling the space, while music played softly in the background. We ate on the floor around the coffee table, the air buzzing with warmth that had nothing to do with obligation. Nobody asked me to solve their problems. Nobody expected me to set myself aside. They just showed up, and that was enough. Near the end of the night, Lena, a friend from work, handed me a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. Happy birthday to the woman who finally chose herself. I folded it carefully and slipped it into a drawer I kept for important things. I didn't cry, but something inside me loosened like a knot pulled free after years of tension. When the last friend left and the apartment grew quiet again, I lit a single candle on the counter and turned off the lights. The glow spread warmly across the room, catching on the flowers by the window. The dishes stacked neatly in the sink, the life I had built piece by piece. The door was locked, the phone silent, and for the first time in years, the quiet didn't scare me. It felt like safety. The next part of my life wasn't about being the family's safety net. It was about standing steady on my own terms. And as I sat there in the candlelight, I knew I had already begun. The candle burned low, its glow steady against the darkened room. I sat quietly listening to the hum of the city through the open window, the air cool against my skin. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for a knock at the door or a call that would pull me back into the same old role. The silence felt whole, not heavy. A week later, I found myself going through a drawer where I kept important papers, my passport, a copy of my lease, some savings tucked away. In the back was an envelope my mother had given me months earlier, labeled for emergencies. I opened it slowly, expecting money or advice, but inside was only a flyer for a storage facility with a note in her handwriting. Natalie might need to keep her things here temporarily. We already put the first month in your name. Hope that's okay. I stared at it for a moment before feeding it through the shredder, not out of anger, but because I knew that part of my life was over. I wasn't the family storage unit, the fallback plan, or the safety net they assumed would always be there. That role had been written for me without my consent, and I had finally closed the book on it. On my birthday, I chose to celebrate myself. I walked along the river in the morning sun, bought flowers in colors that made me smile, and sat in a cafe with a book I had been saving for months. Later, I cooked dinner with friends who laughed easily and filled the apartment with warmth. There were no demands, no conditions, no unspoken expectations, just people who cared because they wanted to, not because they needed something from me. That night, as the last guest left and the quiet settled again, I realized how much had shifted. I hadn't just drawn a line with my family. I had taught myself that choosing peace wasn't selfish, it was necessary. After years of silence and compromise, I finally understood that boundaries are not walls to keep others out. They are doors you decide when to open and when to close. I don't know what the future holds with my parents or with Natalie. Maybe time will soften things, maybe it won't. But I do know this: the life I am building now is mine, steady and whole, and that is enough. And if you've ever been made to feel like your needs come last, I hope you remember that too. You're allowed to choose yourself. You are allowed to protect your peace. Before we end, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had to draw a line with family or someone close? Share your story in the comments. And if this resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe for more.